Welcome to Your Pennsylvania Ancestors with Denise Allen. Whatever the result may be, I carry to my grave the consciousness that at least I meant well for my country. Those words were spoken by President James Buchanan at the end of his term as president. And if you're like me, you're probably curious what Pennsylvania's only president had to say about that. Why was he saying that? And it's a sentiment that maybe some of us share after voting this week in our presidential election. Well, Buchanan was the 15th president of the United States, and you might remember that Abraham Lincoln was the 16th. So the things that happened during Buchanan's term definitely led into the Civil War. And this week I talked with Patrick Clarke, who's the director of James Buchanan's Wheatland. Wheatland was Buchanan's home here in Pennsylvania, and I wanted to ask Patrick about what were Buchanan's policies, what was his politics like, was Buchanan popular in Pennsylvania when he was elected, and just to get a sense in terms of my own ancestors in Pennsylvania and yours too, what was the relation between Buchanan and them? Not in terms of like bloodlines, but in terms of did they share the same viewpoints? So I hope as you listen to the episode, you take into account some of that and think like, would my ancestors have voted for Buchanan given their ethnic background, maybe their work, where they lived in the state? So think about that as you listen to the episode. And I hope you learn a lot. I know I did. And now let's go listen and learn more about James Buchanan. Patrick Clarke, welcome to the podcast. I'm so excited to have you on to talk about the only United States president that came from Pennsylvania, James Buchanan. So if you could introduce yourself to the listeners, the genealogists out there and family historians who are listening about who you are and why you might know so much about James Buchanan.
Okay, well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. And my title here at the organization is Director of President James Buchanan's Wheatland. So essentially, my role is to oversee interpretation of the historic site, do lots of research to make sure that that's accurate as we can get. And I also oversee all the preservation of the historic site. It's not only the mansion, but it's outbuildings, the privy, the outhouse, and also the smokehouse, ice house building. And then the carriage house, which is where I'm sitting right now in the second floor of the carriage house, which postdates Buchanan's time here. I also oversee the museum's visitor services department, which is a whole other ball of wax. And I guess the reason why I'm probably considered the sort of go-to person by a lot of folks for knowing about Buchanan is because for the past 15 years, I've been fairly deeply immersed in researching the man, researching his family members. One of my colleagues that I work with here, she and I have most recently been taking a deep dive into trying to enhance and build out the stories of the domestic workers who he employed over the years. And that's a changing cast of characters. I mean, he lived here from 1849 until his death in 1868. So he had a lot of different employees. And so that's who I am and what I do.
Well, I can't wait for that update because I think the life of everyday working people that surround the famous, can sometimes just be as interesting, especially family historians, because for a lot of us, that could be our relative. We might know that we're not related to Buchanan or Carnegie or Mellon or, pick another famous Pennsylvanian, but we might be related to that domestic servant or, the farmer down the street. So in terms of Buchanan, the one question I sent you right away, I feel like we're in the middle of a presidential election season, and there's a lot of conversation about, on the internet and social media. It's like, oh, we've never been more divided, and is the US headed for another civil war? People will talk about that. And I think about Buchanan because a lot of historians blame him for the Civil War. Like, they'll just say, oh, he made all the wrong policy choices, and
Right.
if it wasn't for Buchanan, it never would have happened. And I think he was in kind of the national limelight for a while. He was, elected in 1856.
Right.
And so, yeah, he was the president before Lincoln. But is it fair to say it's his fault the Civil War started? I mean, I feel like it had been building for a while. It's not just one man's fault, but
The Civil War had been building since the signing of the Constitution, the ratification.
right. Okay. Yeah. Okay.
And Buchanan argued that. It's almost as though he knew that he was going to be nailed for something, regardless of what he did in office. Buchanan certainly deserves some blame. Did he cause the coming of the Civil War? He didn't do much to help stop it. But he, like any US president, has both a foreign set of policies, foreign issues that he's tackling, as well as domestic issues. Buchanan, unfortunately, didn't have a great domestic set of policies. And there was one historian that said Buchanan understood other countries in the world better than he understood his own nation by the time he took office. Now, you take a look at Buchanan's career, and he had an incredible resume. The man started out in the year 1814 at the age of 23, elected as a Federalist. He was a part of the Federalist Party, which were the well-heeled, very conservative politicians that dominated the state of Pennsylvania back just right around the time of the War of 1812. And Buchanan was elected as a state legislator. He served for 2 consecutive terms, and then he got out of politics, and he focused on being a lawyer, which was his chosen profession. But a variety of issues occurred in his life, and he again turned to politics and was convinced to run for office, and he was successfully elected to the U.S. House of Representatives for the Lancaster area. And he took that seat and held on to that seat for 5 consecutive terms. So he was in the U.S. House from 1821 to 1831, which was unprecedented. Now, by that time, well, when he first starts out, he's a Federalist, and then he becomes a Jacksonian Democrat. That particular emergence of that party, he felt a strong affiliation with. So he goes on to become President Jackson's, what they called the minister. We might call them the ambassador to the country of Russia during the years, I think it was 31 through 33. And then he returns from Russia, very successful. He gets the first commercial treaty ever with Russia and returns, and he's a big success. And he becomes one of the next US senators for the state of Pennsylvania. Serves an unexpired term, and then he gets elected for a second term. And toward the end of that second term, he's tapped by President Polk to become the US Secretary of State, which back in the 19th century was the stepping stone to the US presidency. But it wasn't to be so for Buchanan. He tries to get the nomination in 48. He's passed over. He doesn't have the right buzzword. And for the Democrats, popular sovereignty was the big thing. Was lukewarm to the concept of popular sovereignty. And so he kind of goes into semi-retirement. Comes back to this farm, the Wheatland farm, and is in semi-retirement. But the minute the next presidential cycle comes up, he's got his hat in the ring again. So it's 1851. He's trying to get the nomination, and out of the blue comes the dark horse candidate, Franklin Pierce. And Pierce takes the nomination, and he takes the election by storm, because he was coming in at a time where the Whig Party had the White House with Millard Fillmore. Fillmore was the vice president of Zachary Taylor, who died in office 14 months after starting. And Fillmore was not liked by the Taylor people. In fact, when Zachary Taylor died, his entire cabinet resigned. Millard Fillmore had to build up his own cabinet members and start over again. But the Whig Party had imploded. So there was a new party that was starting to form, but there were a whole bunch of little parties, and that gets very confusing. But Buchanan essentially tries to get the nomination, and he's passed over. So the Whigs put up their final candidate, which was during the 1852 campaign. And General Winfield Scott, Old Fuss and Feathers, as he was known, he runs against Pierce, and it's a landslide victory. Pierce was aiming to run basically a squeaky clean administration. Of course, we know that doesn't happen. But during his administration, he appoints Buchanan as the minister to Great Britain, the ambassador to send over to Great Britain. And Buchanan spends 3 years there. And when he comes back, it's 1856. But what's happened in the United States during that 4 years of Pierce's administration is what history records as Bleeding Kansas. It grows out of the 1854 Kansas-Nebraska Act. It grows out of the 1850 Compromise under Fillmore. And Bleeding Kansas is in many ways kind of a mini Civil War. So the whole struggle over states' rights, which is still going on today, but in particular, not only the existence of slavery in the country, but its expansion. And why does what they were known as the slave powers, why do they want slavery to expand? Well, slavery, if you have no slavery allowed in your state, let's take it Massachusetts, and there are no slaves in Massachusetts in the 1850s or the 40s. And you're from, let's say, I don't know, Georgia or one of the southern states where slavery was dominant presence. For every male Black slave, enslaved human being, there's what do they call it, the 3/5? They counted them as a fraction of a vote, even though they weren't allowed to vote. It was based on population. So what does that have to do with politics? Well, the census, representation in Congress. And so the more humans that you have to count, the greater your power base. That's why the Missouri Compromise back in 1821 was so important, because it kind of the peace, it has that imaginary line that went across the country, and everything south of it, if a state came in, then that's fine. You came in as a slave state. But the compromise was that there has to be a state coming in at the same time that's a free state. And it kept that balance of power. So the whole struggle to allow slavery to expand was critically important. Buchanan, of course, is out of the country in Great Britain, all during this really frantic 4 years for Pierce. And by the way, he also does play a role, but it doesn't come back to haunt him until he tries to run for the presidency. As the minister to Great Britain, he's ordered by the Secretary of State to get together with the minister from the United States in France and the minister from the United States in Spain, and to conference in secret. And they choose to meet in Ostend. And what do they create? The Ostend Manifesto, which is the Franklin Pierce's administration secretive attempt to try and purchase Cuba, which of course is south. Even though the Missouri Compromise doesn't exist anymore, it's land that is, not contiguous, but close by the continent. And it would allow them there's slavery already exists there. It could allow them to expand on slavery. So Buchanan's associated with that because he's essentially the author. He's one of the most prominent members of that trio that create the Ostend Manifesto. And that appears in political cartoons during the 1856 campaign for the presidency. And of course, he's running against the very first Republican candidate, Mr. Fremont. And slavery and its expansion, the whole issue with Mormons and polygamy, all of that is part of the 1856 campaign. And he's a Democrat, and the Democrats are the ultra-conservative party. And the reason he was chosen in 56 was because he doesn't have all this baggage from the 4 years that Pierce was in office. He's not in the country. He doesn't have the blood of bleeding Kansas on his hands. He would have it soon enough, though.
Oh, man. Yeah. And so was Buchanan popular in Pennsylvania since he did spend so much time out of the country? Like, who were the people that lived in Pennsylvania that supported him? Because the Democratic Party was split
Right.
amongst it within itself, too, at the time.
Sure, but not as bad in 56.
Okay.
In 56, he's pretty popular. But with this rise of this new liberal party, the Republicans, Pennsylvania is like any other state. There are pockets of broad swaths of the state that were pro-democratic, and there were big sections that were, hey, this Republican Party seems to make a lot of sense to me. I'm going to go with them. Interestingly enough, Buchanan does win the popular vote, and he does win, but by a slim margin. He wins the electoral college vote. I pulled the statistics. I couldn't find the actual statistic that I was looking for, but I recalled when I had researched this before that Lancaster City was this pocket of strong Democratic voters. But the township that the city is carved out of is called Lancaster Township. And Lancaster Township is where Wheatland, the farm where he lives, is located. That goes Republican. So his own neighbors don't even support him. But Buchanan does win the popular vote statewide. Overall, I mean, the just looking at the state of Pennsylvania's voting, Buchanan won 230,686 votes in the popular vote. And for the challengers, Fremont won 147,286. Not too bad. That's a 50% versus 32% for Fremont. Fillmore comes back in the 56 campaign. He's the political candidate for what's known as the American Party, which was the imploded Whig Party reimagined with what were known as the Know Nothings. Their nickname was the Know Nothings. And they're kind of the nativist party. They, if you're an immigrant, you don't belong here. If you're Catholic, you definitely don't belong here. And so he manages to get 82,189 votes in Pennsylvania, or almost 18%. So I would say in general that Buchanan was, I wouldn't say well liked, but he was liked. He overall, he carries the entire South. And really, frankly, they propel him to the southern states, slave-owning states, propel him to the White House. Now, did they like him? Most didn't, really. They felt that he was kind of a okay candidate, but not really powerful. If we had to use a term that's used today to describe Buchanan, he was a moderate. He didn't have a strong stance this way or that way. He was kind of in the middle. But politics in the mid-19th century is fraught with lots of problems.
Yeah, I've tried to read about that time period, and it's like reading someone's diary of like what happened in high school. Like it's like there's all these political parties, like within the state of Pennsylvania, all these disagreements, all these different power centers and brokers and back and forth. And I read a history of Pennsylvania, and when Lincoln got into office, I guess he appointed some Pennsylvanians to his cabinet. And he said the people from Pennsylvania caused him more heartache than the people that the states that had just seceded the Union. And I was like, really? Like, but Pennsylvania was so central, I guess, to politics because of coal and industry and banking
yeah, exactly. And we were one of the biggest states as far as the electoral college votes were concerned. To secure Pennsylvania was a pretty sure thing. Yeah.
So tell me, you said you were researching Buchanan's background, and I just have to ask, when I read that he was Scots-Irish, and we have all these stories about the Scots-Irish in Pennsylvania, and was there anything about that or his background and his upbringing?
Yeah, I found that to be an interesting question that you sent me. My family is from Ireland, both sides, pretty pretty steeped in it. My wife is Highland Scot for the most part, and we were both talking about this question that you posed to me. I did find a quote that Buchanan mentioned about his heritage. He said that my Ulster blood is a priceless heritage.
Huh.
So he certainly, he loved his father and mother deeply. He had great respect, but he was also fearful. I've read that. I think one of his biographers, Dr. Klein, who wrote a biography back in the early 1960s, said that Buchanan not only loved and revered his father, but he also feared him. And looking at James Buchanan Sr., which there was no use of the suffix after their names, but for the sake of keeping our sanity here, because they're both James, the senior was, I wouldn't say that he was a wealthy man, but he was a well-to-do man. He had, classic pull yourself up by your bootstraps, an immigrant who came to the country, worked his tail off for a guy named John Toms at a trading post in the notch in the mountains, the mountain range of the Alleghenies, and saved up enough money to go back to North Mountain, where his uncle had first cared for him when he came over to this country, where he had met Elizabeth Spear, who was a neighbor, and asked her father for her hand in marriage, and married her, and then took her back to South Mountain, where the trading post was, and he bought the business. He had saved up his money and bought the business. And that's where they settled. That's a little town called Cove Gap, Pennsylvania, and that's where their first, I think it was at least 4 children born there. James is the second one, James Jr. And by the time young James is 5 years old, his father has moved the family to Mercersburg, which is about 4 miles away, built a 2-story brick house, and had a dry goods store on the first floor. He had managed to buy a farm, the Dunwoody Farm is what it was called. And so they were, living that American dream. And his father became very well respected member of the Federalist Party, that conservative, so I guess in thinking about this question, I thought, wow, how do I answer this? I mean, I would say my answer is kind of hinged on 2 caveats. One, my own Celtic heritage, and the other one is pure speculation.
Sounds like a good genealogy answer then, because we're speculating a lot when we do our
exactly.
research.
Yeah. Well, and as we mentioned earlier, we were talking about the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party was like the Federalist Party. It was the conservative, this is what the Constitution says, and we only follow the Constitution, the letter of the law. So yeah, he was painfully conservative. Can you say that about the Celts? Some, probably a fair number. I know in his personal life, his niece, Harriet Lane, who he had taken in as a ward when she was orphaned, his nephew, James Buchanan Henry, who was also an orphaned child, and he took him in as a ward. They both described their uncle as very strict. Politically, historians have described him as a strict constructionist when it comes to the US Constitution. And you take a look at some of the activities during both his congressional life, but let's focus right now on his presidential years. His first 2 years in office were dominated by the Kansas Territory. He chooses to send Robert Walker, who was a northerner who had relocated early on in life to Mississippi, I believe, became a slave owner. And Buchanan decided, well, here's a man that I want to send off and make him the territorial governor of this territory of Kansas. He'll get things under control. He agrees with Walker to allow, if any constitution is formed in the territory, that it Walker said it has to be ratified by the people living there before it's sent to Congress. Buchanan agrees with that. But then when the rubber hits the road and the time comes for the ratification to occur, Buchanan abandons his own appointed governor, and he has this urgency that he wants to get Kansas into the nation as quickly as possible. And he starts to spend all sorts of political capital. By the end of 1857, his first year in December, he is pushing really hard on Congress to bring Kansas in under the Lecompton Constitution, which he knows is a pro-slavery constitution. I don't think he really cared one way or the other, whether it was pro-slavery or not, even though a colleague of his, who was a well-respected historian, former cabinet member of Polk's administration, which Buchanan was too, they knew each other well, and he says to Buchanan, you know what, you should allow this business of popular sovereignty to really play out in the favor of the Democratic Party and ensure that the Kansas Territory becomes a free state, and do that as quickly as possible. Well, he only pays attention to the latter half of that advice. He wants to get them in as quickly as possible, and it's got to be under this Constitution, because why? Lecompton was appointed as the seat of government for this territory by his predecessor. So therefore, strict construction, this is the territory's, governing body. They're saying that the Lecompton Constitution is it, despite the fact that there's all sorts of evidence that this Constitution was formed by a bunch of thugs who were basically stole the territory's legislature as well as their constitutional convention. So, people were being murdered. There was a description in one of the local newspapers from the territory that I found during some of my research on the Kansas debacle out there, that there was a preacher pulled from his pulpit in the middle of church, tarred and feathered and thrown into the Missouri River to just float down the river and die. So those kind of atrocities were occurring on a regular basis. It wasn't a secret what was going on. But yet you have this president sitting back in Washington, and he's not only trying to push it through with political capital, by the time the calendar year rolls around, he's expended all of his political capital. Now he starts to use monetary bribes, is what it amounts to get Congress members to vote his way. And they're just not going to have it. So, and then of course the midterms hit, and he loses all of his majority in Congress. He now no longer has a pro-democratic Congress. He's got the Republicans have taken over. So Buchanan's very dogmatic on certain issues. And so I would say, knowing myself, members of my family, my wife, members of her family, perhaps there's some truth to that. I don't know.
There's a little bit of a stubbornness, I guess, to that.
Yeah.
Or a little bit of
the old saying, squeeze blood out of a rock.
Yeah. Half my family has that Scots-Irish background, and I think of those folks and their personalities, and they definitely would stick to a point of view and not
absolutely,
and not bend. They weren't willing to bend, and some of that's good, and some of it, isn't.
Yeah.
As always, you take anything to an extreme, and it's not helpful.
He was a very religious man, but he never joined the church until after he got out of politics.
Interesting.
He was raised in the Presbyterian faith, but one of the problems that he had, and this is it gives us an insight into his sense of free will. I believe this, but I really question this. He was very comfortable, more so with the Presbyterian faith than he was with any other faith, although philanthropically, he supported nearly every church in Lancaster,
Hmm.
regardless of their denomination. Although he didn't support the Methodists. I think about it, but he gave to the Catholic Church a lot. But he was 70 years old when he retires from the presidency, and he petitions the Presbyterian Church, which now we call First Presbyterian here in Lancaster. He petitions to become a member officially, and of course they ask him a bunch of questions, whether he commits to this in the faith, etc. And one of the very, very important principles back then in the Calvinist faith was predestination. And Buchanan did not believe in that. And he just flat out said that he didn't believe in it because they rejected him. They rejected his petition to join the church. But he continued to go and attend church there. And I guess he petitioned them again. And one of his close friends, who was also raised in the Presbyterian faith, but had, as an adult, converted over to the German Reformed Church, was Dr. Nevin, the Reverend Dr. Nevin, who was back in the early 1850s, late 1840s, was the president of Marshall College. And Buchanan was on the board and the lawyer for Franklin College. And the two of them, Buchanan as the lawyer for Franklin, shepherded the legal merger of the two schools to become Franklin and Marshall. And they became close friends. And in fact, Nevin oftentimes counseled him on issues of faith and jokingly suggested, well, if you don't believe that, you could always join the German Reform. And he said, well, I don't believe anything they believe in. So he managed to help him with talking points, I guess, to get around this whole issue of what he believes. And the church let him in. So he spent his last years of his life, at least, a member of the church. But he had told a Presbyterian minister that he met while he was on vacation when he was still the president of the United States, that he feared that if he joined with the church while he was still in office, there would be a loud cry that could be heard from Maine to California. Hypocrite. So he had this sense of himself, that here's James Buchanan, the politician, and here's James Buchanan, the private citizen. In his mind, the two shouldn't collide, although they did all the time.
So for us to finish up, I do want to hear if you have a favorite story from his time at Wheatland. Because he did have this niece and a nephew. There's no direct descendants that we know of James Buchanan.
Not of James Buchanan, yeah. Yeah,
So
his youngest brother had 10 kids, and they've got plenty of descendants that are named Buchanan. Well, yeah, I thought about that. The one that there's a couple of them. I was looking in my notes and I couldn't find this particular letter, but I know it's there because I've written about it on a number of occasions. And it was while they were at Wheatland. He and his niece, both of them have to do with his niece, Harriet. The one story, which is, I think, just a cute little story, she owned a terrier dog that she named Punch. And Buchanan didn't really like this dog. She also kept canaries. So there's actually two pet stories in one. The canary story is kind of tragic. The two of them exchanged, I don't know, probably thousands of letters in their lifetime. But this one letter, Harriet's off traveling, which she did a lot. She was off traveling quite a bit. And whenever he would write to her, it would be a combination of political stories that they would share. He would sometimes scold her and tell her, that she's acting frivolous or something. And there was also gossip involved. So in this particular letter, it's a postscript at the end where he said, oh, by the way, Dick the canary was taken from its cage by some flying varmint or an owl. So poor girl, she gets this wonderful letter, and she's reading through it and she gets the postscript. Oh my God. Dick the Canary. Ended up as lunch for some owl. But and the second story was with Punch. She apparently loved Punch, this little terrier. And Buchanan's dog was a Newfoundland. Her name was Lara, Lara. And Lara actually goes with him to the White House. And we found a wonderful picture of Lara standing outside of the White House with someone holding her leash. But Harriet had apparently written this letter asking her uncle about what's happening and how, and in the body of her letter, she obviously asks, how's Punch doing? That's one of the first things that she asks, because he starts off his letter saying, of all the things for you to, be asking me about, you ask about Punch. Well, I guess I can drag myself to tell you that Punch is doing okay, although I really could care less. Something to that effect. So he really does not like this dog. But back to the owls, the thing that was really disturbing for me, just because I love animals, but apparently they considered owls to be a real pest on the farm. And Harriet wrote a letter to, I think it was her friend, Sophie Plitt, in Philadelphia, and was telling her about how she and her uncle returned home from their travels. And the other night we went out and we were shooting owls on the farm. And it's like, so those are kind of a few stories that just popped into my head when you asked that question. But the one thing, it's a story that doesn't necessarily have to do with Wheatland. That's a story that I like to share because I think that it points to a man who is difficult to understand. Again, this personal life, public life, persona where they collide. Privately, Buchanan despised this whole institution of slavery and enslaving people. And there is one documented set of letters between him and his brother-in-law's parents, the Henry family, down in Shepherdstown, Virginia, which is now part of West Virginia. And Buchanan, back in the 1830s, approaches the Henrys and asks them if he can purchase these two female enslaved people they own. And he was just getting ready to go into the US Senate. Some historians argue that, he was doing this just to make himself look good. But his nephew says that he was known to do this throughout his adult life, to purchase enslaved humans, bring them to Pennsylvania, provide them with employment, and eventually provide them with their emancipation. And of course, by the decade of the 1840s, the minute they cross over the boundary of the state of Pennsylvania, the Commonwealth doesn't allow enslavement of people to take place anymore. So Buchanan, I think, as a private individual, tried to do some good when it came to this whole weird institution of slavery. But when he had the power within his grasp as a politician, an elected official, he did virtually nothing. So
yeah, it's really something. I think we can learn more from Buchanan than we can from Lincoln in terms of the struggle that we each individually go through, and then as our country around whatever issue. I mean, pick an issue and the private versus public. So for folks that, we're still in the middle of this pandemic, who would have guessed?
Yeah.
But I noticed Wheatland's doing some virtual tours now. If people wanted to see a little insight about Wheatland, and Buchanan's libraries online, is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah, we just launched our online presidential library. That's something it was a strategic plan that Lancaster History established when Tom and I successfully merged the organizations together. We set up a strategic plan over 10 years ago. And that was one of our strategic goals. And we were thrilled to have that go online this year. Yes, we're offering Zoom tours. Folks can just go to our website, www.lancasterhistory.org, and go to our visit link. You can choose to visit the inside of Wheatland through a Zoom tour. We are going to be offering, starting the Monday of Thanksgiving week, we're going to be offering, shifting our regular interpretation over to the Yuletide season. So we'll have the house decorated. And then that goes to the end of December. Now, we're also offering in-person outdoor tours right now where folks can learn a little bit of the history of Buchanan, but it's a broader history story about the history of this, what we call the campus of history, which is 11 acres of the 22 and a half acres that Buchanan owned. And we start with Benjamin Hershey III, who owned the land beyond the farm that Buchanan owned. He owned over 400 acres of land that was sold to the Farmers Bank. And then we walk people around the campus and talk about all the different people who owned this farm, who built the mansion, did it change architecturally, which it did, which is fascinating in itself if you're into architecture. Then we talk about Buchanan and Harriet Lane Johnston, his niece, who becomes the fifth owner of the farm, and then a little bit about the Wilson family, who gave the land that the Historical Society was built upon. So it's kind of a fun program. We'll do it as long as we can outdoors. And our research library is open for folks to be able to purchase their admission online. There's just so many slots per day. We're open right now Thursday through Saturday for in-person activities. And the other thing that starts this Thursday is in-person access for self-guided visits to our exhibition Lancaster in the 60s, which opened up in 2019. And of course, it wasn't open very long before the pandemic hit. So.
Okay. Well, that's great. I hope people take advantage of that because it is a wonderful site. It's a nice little slice of Pennsylvania history, out in Lancaster. Not everything happened in Philadelphia. I always have to tell people. Patrick Clarke, thank you for being on the podcast and sharing all the complications of Buchanan's life and a little bit of our history. I really appreciate it to help genealogists and family historians get a little bit of insight and know that the names and dates that they're looking on, there's a huge layer underneath that can be explored. So thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you again to Patrick Clarke for sharing the life of Buchanan with us. I know I learned a lot. Especially, I didn't know he had pets, so I'm always excited to hear about a president with pets and what their pets were. And I especially now have a new perspective when I think about my Scots-Irish ancestors, when I think about my German ancestors who fought in the Civil War, and maybe what they could have felt or believed in regards to the issue of slavery, enslaved persons, and the breakup of the Union running up to the Civil War. So this period of the 1850s in the entire United States is interesting, but I think it's especially interesting in Pennsylvania because we did have the president during that time period was one of ours. So if you are watching this episode on YouTube, I'd love if you click the subscribe button. And if you're listening to this on a podcast, I'd also love if you clicked on the subscribe button. Next week, we're going to do an episode on voting records in Pennsylvania, where to find them, what they consist of during different time periods, and maybe some clues you can get about your ancestors and ways it can help your genealogical research if you're stuck. So you'll be the first to get notified when those episodes go up if you hit that subscribe button. And the notifications, of course, turn those on for that. And If you have any feedback about the episode, I love your comments, questions. You can reach me at paancestors.com and also in the comments section below and in the reviews. This is Denise Allen, and I hope you have a rewarding week researching your Pennsylvania ancestors.